The night was suffocatingly still as Alex stepped into the shadowed entrance of the old weeping forest. The air carried a damp, metallic chill that clung to his skin, making every breath feel heavy and deliberate. This was no ordinary forest. The locals spoke of it in hushed whispers, warning travelers of the cursed land where trees cried red tears under the moonlight. But Alex, driven by his insatiable curiosity as a botanist, dismissed the stories as superstitions. The allure of discovering an unknown natural phenomenon, a resin so unique it could rewrite scientific studies, outweighed any sense of caution. The first steps into the forest were uneventful, though unnervingly quiet. No chirping of insects, no rustling leaves, just an unnatural silence that seemed to amplify the sound of his own heartbeat. The path ahead twisted and turned like a serpent, the towering trees on either side arching over him, their gnarled branches forming skeletal hands clawing at the night sky. As Alex ventured deeper, he began to notice faint markings on the bark, deep grooves and scars that seemed almost deliberate, as if carved by something with intent. His flashlight's beam flickered, casting erratic shadows that seemed to move when he wasn't looking. Then came the first sound, a faint sob. It was distant but distinct, like a child weeping in the far reaches of the forest. Alex froze, his breath hitching as the sound grew louder, closer, until it seemed to echo from all directions. He spun around, his flashlight trembling in his grip. "Hello," he called out, his voice swallowed by the oppressive darkness. No response came, only more sobs, layered now with a wet, dripping sound, like thick liquid falling onto leaves. Curiosity wrestled with fear as he pressed on. The smell hit him next, a pungent, iron-like scent that turned his stomach. It was faint at first, but intensified as he approached a clearing. His flashlight revealed the source, a tree unlike any other he had seen. Its bark was a deep, unnatural black, and from its twisted trunk oozed a viscous red substance that pooled at its base. It wasn't sap, it was too thick, too vibrant, and it smelled unmistakably like blood. Alex hesitated, the primal part of his brain screaming at him to turn back, to leave the cursed place. But his rational side, the scientist in him, urged him closer. Kneeling by the pool of red, he reached out with a gloved hand to collect a sample. The instant his fingers touched the liquid, a shock ran up his arm, freezing him in place. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he swore he saw faces in the bark of the tree, twisted, anguished faces silently screaming at him. He stumbled back, heart racing, and the forest responded. The sobbing grew louder, joined by a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from the trees themselves. "Leave," the voices hissed, overlapping, merging into a single guttural command. Alex scrambled to his feet, his flashlight beam darting wildly across the clearing. The shadows seemed to move independently of the light, creeping toward him, closing in. A sudden snap of a branch behind him sent him running. The path he had followed so carefully now seemed to twist in unnatural ways, leading him deeper instead of out. His flashlight flickered again and died, plunging him into near-total darkness. Only the faint glow of the moon, filtered through the skeletal branches above, gave him any sense of direction. And then ahead he saw it, a faint, ghostly light hovering between the trees. It flickered like a flame but cast no shadows. Drawn to it despite his terror, Alex approached, his legs trembling with each step. The light led him to another clearing, smaller but more sinister. The trees here were not merely crying. They were bleeding, their trunks pulsating as if alive. The red liquid dripped onto the ground, forming symbols that Alex could not recognize but felt compelled to understand. His mind screamed that he shouldn't be here, that this was a mistake, but his body moved forward, as if drawn by an invisible force. And then he saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, shrouded in darkness, its form blending with the trees. It didn't move, but Alex felt its gaze pierce through him, cold and unrelenting. The sobbing stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so profound it was deafening. The figure raised an arm, pointing directly at him, and Alex's blood ran cold as a single thought entered his mind, not his own but placed there by something ancient and malevolent. "You should not have come." As Alex delved deeper into the forest, the oppressive atmosphere seemed to thicken, making every breath feel like inhaling shadows. The trees whispered to one another, their creaking branches forming a language too ancient for comprehension. As the faint moonlight pierced the canopy, Alex stumbled upon a peculiar sight. A small clearing dominated by a single, twisted tree that seemed older than the forest itself. Its gnarled bark was scarred with symbols, etched deep as if by claws. But what truly froze Alex in place was a faint melody that drifted through the air, soft and haunting, a tune that stirred something deep within him. His heart raced as memories long buried clawed their way to the surface. That melody, it wasn't unfamiliar. It was the same lullaby his grandmother used to hum when he was a child, just before he had been lost in a forest eerily similar to this one. He remembered waking up days later, disoriented, with a deep scar running along his arm, one he could never explain. Now, standing in this foreboding clearing, Alex noticed something hanging from one of the tree's low-hanging branches, a small, weathered amulet. It was unmistakable, crafted from dark wood and etched with intricate patterns. It was identical to the one his grandmother had shown him, calling it a protector against the darkness. As Alex reached out, his fingers trembling, the temperature dropped sharply, and the melody shifted. The once soothing lullaby turned discordant, the notes twisting into an eerie cacophony. Shadows lengthened unnaturally around him, and he could feel a presence watching, no, stalking him from the depths of the trees. The amulet swayed as if reacting to the unseen force. Gripping the amulet in his hand, Alex felt a jolt course through him. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he was no longer in the clearing. Instead, he stood in a nightmarish version of his childhood home, the walls dripping with that same crimson resin. The whispers from the trees followed him, but now they seemed to come from the house itself, calling his name, beckoning him to enter. The air was thick with dread, and every instinct told him to run, yet his feet refused to move. In this vision, Alex saw himself as a child, standing before the twisted tree, tears streaming down his face as the lullaby echoed. The memory, fragmented and distorted, played out like a scene from a broken film. A shadow loomed behind his younger self, its form shifting between human and something far worse. Alex screamed at the boy to move, to run, but the child stood frozen, staring at the scarred tree as if in a trance. The vision shattered as suddenly as it began, leaving Alex gasping for air back in the clearing. The amulet in his hand felt warm, almost alive, and the scar on his arm throbbed painfully. It was clear now, this wasn't his first encounter with the forest. It had marked him before, and he had unknowingly returned to its domain. The question that gripped him with icy terror was why. Before Alex could gather his thoughts, the whispers grew louder, forming words in a language that sent chills down his spine. The symbols on the tree's bark began to glow faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. Alex stumbled back, but the forest seemed to close in around him, the branches twisting into grotesque shapes, their silhouettes resembling grasping hands. The melody returned, faint but insistent, pulling him deeper into the mystery of the forest and his own fractured past. Alex's steps slowed as he emerged into another clearing, this one dominated by a massive, ancient tree that dwarfed the others. Its trunk was covered in deep, oozing wounds, leaking the same crimson resin that stained the forest floor. The air here felt heavy, suffocating, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. As Alex approached, the ground beneath his feet softened unnaturally, as though he were walking on flesh. A sense of dread clung to him like a second skin. From the base of the tree, a voice emerged, not a sound carried by the wind, but something directly invading his mind. It spoke with a hollow, guttural tone, laced with an undercurrent of malice. "You have returned, marked one. The debt remains unpaid." Alex stumbled back, his heart pounding, but the voice continued, relentless and inescapable. It spoke of a bargain made long ago, a promise forged in blood that Alex had no memory of. Yet, deep inside, he felt the truth of it. Before he could react, the ground beneath the tree shifted, revealing what appeared to be a hollow cavity. Inside, Alex saw something that made his blood run cold. A figure suspended in the resin, its features distorted but unmistakably human. It was his sister, her eyes closed as though in sleep, her body eerily untouched by time. A wave of nausea hit him as memories flooded back, the search parties, the endless questions, and the hollow years after her disappearance. She had been here all along, trapped in the forest's sinister grasp. The voice returned, colder now, as the tree's branches seemed to lean toward him like skeletal fingers. A soul was promised. You must choose, free her or walk away. But know this, the forest takes what it is owed. Tears streamed down Alex's face as he realized the stakes. If he freed her, the forest demanded a replacement, and the only one available was him. He would take her place, his body encased in resin, his soul bound to the forest's darkness. But if he left her, she would remain trapped, her fate sealed by the same ancient curse that had ensnared so many before them. The tree pulsed with life, its bark creaking and groaning, as if mocking his indecision. Around him, the forest grew restless. Shadows danced between the trees, and the melody returned, this time layered with a faint, pleading voice that sounded like his sister's. "Alex," it whispered, "don't leave me." Her voice cracked with despair, but there was something else in it, a subtle, sinister edge, as though it wasn't entirely her speaking. Alex fell to his knees, clutching the amulet in his trembling hands. The choice was impossible. Sacrificing himself would save her, but the forest had already shown its malevolence. Would she truly be free, or would she simply be drawn back into its clutches? And what of the memories they shared? Would she even remember him, or would the forest erase him from existence entirely? The air grew colder, and the tree's branches began to writhe, closing in around him. The voice grew louder, more insistent, now layering threats with promises of release. Alex's scar burned like fire, the pain searing into his mind as if branding the decision upon him. He screamed into the void, his voice swallowed by the oppressive darkness. Then the forest offered him one last vision. He saw himself walking away, leaving the clearing untouched. His life continued, empty and hollow, haunted by guilt and whispers in the shadows. But he also saw a flicker of peace. Was it a lie? In contrast, he saw himself sacrificing everything, his body consumed by the resin, his mind fractured and lost. Yet his sister's eyes opened, free at last. The forest waited, patient but hungry. Alex knew he had to choose, and whatever decision he made, there would be no turning back. The impossible choice loomed, a cruel testament to the forest's power and its endless thirst for suffering. As Alex knelt in torment before the ancient tree, the forest seemed to inhale sharply, its oppressive silence replaced by an orchestra of whispers. The voices weren't random, they spoke in eerie unison, their tones soft yet sharp, like a blade sliding against silk. They surrounded him, weaving through the darkness, each word clawing at his sanity. The language was foreign yet disturbingly familiar, as though some primal part of him understood its meaning. He clutched his head, desperate to block out the sound, but the whispers only grew louder, wrapping around his mind like suffocating vines. From the corners of his vision, the shadows began to shift. At first, they were subtle, mere flickers at the edge of perception. But as Alex's breathing quickened, the shapes took on horrifying forms. They slithered and twisted unnaturally, humanoid figures with elongated limbs and faces that flickered like a dying flame. Their eyes, if they could be called that, burned with an unnatural light, pinpoints of malice that pierced the darkness. One shadow detached itself from the others, moving with a predatory grace. It circled Alex, its presence freezing the air around him. It whispered directly into his ear, its voice a grotesque mimicry of his sister's. "You left me, Alex. Why didn't you save me?" He spun around, searching for the source, but the figure dissolved into the air, reforming behind him, its mocking laughter filling the clearing. The ancient tree seemed to respond, its branches creaking and groaning as if laughing along with the shadows. Crimson resin began to seep from the bark in greater volumes, forming rivulets that snaked across the ground toward Alex. When the resin touched his boots, it burned, not physically, but in his mind, like 1,000 memories being dragged to the surface all at once. He saw flashes of his childhood, his sister's laughter, and the haunting moment he had found her room empty all those years ago. The whispers transformed into guttural chants, each syllable vibrating through his chest. The air felt heavier with every breath, and Alex realized with growing horror that the forest was alive. Not just the trees, but the ground, the shadows, and even the air itself. Everything around him was connected, bound by some ancient, malevolent force. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, more oppressive than the noise. Then came a sound, a single, deliberate knock. It came from behind him, from the base of the tree. Slowly, he turned, every fiber of his being screaming at him to run. What he saw made his blood turn to ice. The resin pooling around the tree's base began to rise, shaping itself into a form. It was humanoid but grotesquely wrong, its body a dripping mass of crimson, its limbs twisted at impossible angles. The figure's head tilted unnaturally, its hollow eyes locking onto Alex. It raised an arm, pointing directly at him, and the whispers resumed, this time forming coherent words, "Your blood. Your debt." Alex staggered back, his mind racing. The shadows around him moved closer, their forms now more solid, their faces twisted into grotesque imitations of people he once knew. He saw his grandmother, her eyes empty and mouth stretched into a silent scream. He saw his sister, her form blending in and out of the shadows, her hands reaching toward him with desperation. Or was it malice? The environment itself began to shift. The forest floor cracked and buckled, exposing roots that writhed like serpents. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the trees swayed without wind, their branches clawing at the sky. The oppressive atmosphere pressed down on Alex, making him feel like he was being swallowed whole by the darkness. In the midst of the chaos, the whispers began to form a melody, a twisted, haunting rendition of the lullaby that had haunted his memories. It was no longer comforting, it was a siren's song, pulling him toward the tree. He fought against it, but every step felt like wading through quicksand. The shadows closed in, their laughter merging with the melody, creating a cacophony of terror. And then, the voice of the forest spoke again, louder than ever before. Choose, marked one. Stay, and your torment ends. Leave, and the debt will follow you. There is no escape. The crimson figure at the tree's base began to move toward him, each step oozing with menace. Alex was paralyzed, his mind teetering on the edge of madness. The forest had become a living nightmare, and Alex realized with chilling certainty that whatever decision he made, he would never truly be free. The shadows whispered his name, the resin pulsed like blood, and the ancient tree stood as the heart of this malevolent force, waiting for him to succumb. As Alex hesitated, caught in the grip of his impossible choice, the forest around him seemed to exhale, its shadows growing darker and more animated. The whispers that had lingered at the edges of his perception now surged forward, weaving into his thoughts like a venomous thread. At first, they were incoherent murmurs, but as Alex strained to listen, they began to form words, phrases, an unsettling mixture of pleading, warnings, and mockery. "Save her, Alex," one voice hissed, trembling with despair. "She's waiting for you." Another, colder and tinged with malice, taunted him. "She's not who you think she is. She never was." He spun around, trying to pinpoint the source, but the whispers seemed to emanate from everywhere at once, a cacophony that bent reality itself. The forest transformed before his eyes. Trees twisted unnaturally, their trunks warping into grotesque shapes resembling faces frozen in silent screams. Branches reached for him like skeletal arms, while the crimson resin dripping from the trees began to pool around his feet, bubbling as though alive. With every step, Alex felt as if the forest was closing in, a living entity feeding off his fear and confusion. The whispering voices began to overlap, becoming louder and more urgent. Some spoke in tongues he couldn't understand, while others imitated the voices of people he knew, his grandmother, his childhood friends, even his sister. Their tones ranged from pleading to accusing, as if the forest was peeling back layers of his mind to expose his deepest vulnerabilities. Suddenly, Alex felt a sharp pain in his chest, as though invisible claws were raking across his skin. He looked down to see faint, glowing lines appearing on his body, forming strange symbols that pulsed in rhythm with the whispers. His scar throbbed violently, the searing pain nearly blinding him. He stumbled backward, only to find himself surrounded by shadowy figures, amorphous shapes that flickered between human and monstrous forms. Their hollow eyes seemed to pierce into his soul, and their mouths moved in silent chants that reverberated through his mind. One of the shadows stepped forward, more defined than the others. It resembled his sister, but its features were subtly wrong, her eyes too wide, her smile unnaturally sharp. The shadow extended a hand toward him, and though no words came from its lips, Alex heard her voice clearly in his mind. "Come with me, Alex. You don't have to be afraid anymore." As her hand drew closer, the surrounding whispers grew deafening, their tones turning desperate. "Don't trust her," one voice screamed. Another, low and sinister, urged, "Take her hand, and the pain will end." Alex froze, his body trembling with indecision, as the shadows around him began to circle, their forms melting into the ground and reforming behind him. The forest itself seemed to breathe, its darkness pulsating like a living organism. The tree at the center of the clearing loomed larger now, its bark cracking open to reveal hollow cavities that resembled mouths. From these openings, a deep, guttural growl emerged, vibrating through the air and into Alex's bones. The whispers suddenly coalesced into a single, unified voice, cold, commanding, and undeniably ancient. "The forest has waited long enough. Make your choice." The shadow of his sister lunged toward him, her outstretched hand now tipped with sharp, claw-like nails. Alex's vision blurred as the shadows and whispers closed in, the forest demanding its due. Alex's heart pounded as the forest's oppressive grip tightened around him. The whispers that had invaded his mind became a deafening chorus, each voice tearing at his sanity with conflicting emotions, despair, anger, guilt, and longing. The shadowy figure resembling his sister loomed closer, her distorted smile stretching wider with every step. But as he stood frozen, his vision began to fracture, images flashing before him, each more horrifying than the last. In one vision, he saw himself kneeling before the ancient tree, his body encased in resin, his mouth open in a silent scream as the forest consumed him. In another, he saw the clearing ablaze, flames licking at the twisted branches while the shadowy figures wailed in agony. Yet the most horrifying vision was the one that showed him returning home, his sister free, but her eyes hollow and lifeless, as if she had left a piece of herself behind in the forest. The whispers shifted tone, now dripping with temptation. "You can end this," they purred. "The fear will stop if you surrender. It's easier to let go." The shadows around him began to blur, taking on familiar shapes. Friends, loved ones, people he thought he had forgotten. They reached for him, their faces twisted in expressions of pity and disdain. "Why fight?" they asked. "You're too weak. You've always been too weak." Alex's legs buckled, and he fell to the ground, the weight of the forest pressing down on him. The crimson resin pooled closer, reflecting his face, but not as he was now. In its gleaming surface, he saw himself as a child, his eyes wide with terror as he stumbled through a similar forest, hearing the same whispers, feeling the same dread. This wasn't the first time he had been here, and the realization struck him like a physical blow. His mind spiraled as the forest invaded his thoughts, replaying moments he had buried deep. His sister crying out for help as she disappeared into the woods, the nights he spent blaming himself, the guilt that had eaten away at him ever since. The forest amplified his fears, his regrets, turning them into weapons against him. The shadow of his sister knelt beside him now, her voice soft and soothing. "It's okay, Alex," she whispered. "You can stop running. You can stay here, with me." Her touch was cold, sending shivers through his body, but her words carried a strange allure. The promise of an end to his torment was almost too tempting to resist. But as he looked into her hollow eyes, he saw something else, a flicker of darkness that wasn't her. It was the forest, manipulating him, preying on his fear. Rage and defiance sparked within him, and he clenched his fists, forcing himself to stand. "You won't take me," he muttered through gritted teeth, his voice trembling but determined. The whispers turned to roars, the shadows lunging toward him as the forest retaliated against his defiance. The ground beneath him trembled, the tree's branches stretching out like claws to drag him back. But Alex held his ground, his fear now replaced by a burning resolve. He didn't know if he could win, but he knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't let the forest break him. The shadows paused, as if reconsidering, before the forest unleashed its full wrath. Alex braced himself, knowing the battle was far from over. The forest erupted into chaos as Alex stood his ground, defying its dark will. The ancient tree at the clearing's center groaned, its bark splitting open to reveal an immense hollow that pulsed with an otherworldly glow. From within, tendrils of resin, now shimmering with a sickly luminescence, slithered outward, twisting through the air like living serpents. The whispers that had tormented him coalesced into one voice, a deep, resonant growl that seemed to emanate from the very roots of the forest. "You cannot defy us, Alex," the voice intoned, its power shaking the ground beneath his feet. "The pact is sealed. Your blood binds you here." The air grew thick, and Alex's breath came in ragged gasps as the symbols etched into his skin began to burn brighter, their searing heat threatening to consume him. The forest wasn't just alive, it was sentient, ancient, and ravenous. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to flee, but there was nowhere to run. The shadows that had haunted him now solidified, circling him like predators closing in on prey. Suddenly, the tree's hollow pulsed again, and from its depths emerged a figure, twisted and grotesque, a mockery of human form. Its limbs were elongated, its face featureless except for hollow, glowing eyes that burned with malevolence. Alex froze as the entity reached out, pointing a claw-like finger at him. The voice returned, colder now, as if relishing his torment. "You carry the mark. You owe us a soul." In that moment, Alex understood. The forest wasn't just feeding on fear. It thrived on sacrifice, binding its victims to an endless cycle of torment. And he was the next link in its chain. Yet, as despair clawed at his mind, a flicker of defiance remained. His hand gripped the wooden amulet, its once familiar warmth now a sharp, biting cold. It felt heavier than before, as if it carried the weight of all who had faced this moment and failed. The entity's form twisted, and its voice shifted, taking on the tone of his sister. "Alex," it pleaded, "please don't leave me. You can save me. Just let go." He faltered, the the sight of her outstretched hand breaking through his resolve. But deep within, he felt the wrongness in her voice, the forest's corruption seeping through every word. The clearing grew darker, the trees tightening their circle, as if to force him into submission. Alex's scar throbbed violently, and images flooded his mind, visions of his sister, of their childhood, of the day she vanished. But these memories were tainted, distorted by the forest's influence. The truth lay buried beneath the lies, and he had to find it before it was too late. With trembling hands, Alex held the amulet aloft, its surface now glowing faintly. The symbols on his skin pulsed in response, and the entity recoiled, its form flickering as if destabilized. Alex's voice was weak, but firm as he spoke. "I don't know what you are, but you won't have me, or her." The forest roared in anger, the ground splitting open as crimson resin surged upward, forming grotesque shapes that clawed at Alex. The entity lunged, its hollow eyes burning with fury, but Alex stood firm, gripping the amulet tighter. The symbols on his skin flared brilliantly, casting the clearing in a blinding light. For a brief moment, the forest recoiled, its power weakened by Alex's defiance. But the battle was far from over. The entity's form shattered into tendrils of darkness, each one snaking toward Alex with terrifying speed. The ground beneath him quaked, and the tree's hollow emitted an ear-splitting shriek, its resonance vibrating through his very bones. And then silence. The forest held its breath, waiting, watching. Alex knew the moment of truth had arrived. He could feel the weight of countless lives pressing down on him, their whispers urging him to make the right choice. But what was right? Sacrifice himself to free his sister, or fight against the forest's ancient will? The amulet burned in his hand, and he felt its power surge through him, a final, desperate push to confront the darkness. Alex raised it high, his voice trembling but resolute. "If you want me, take me. But I will not bow." The clearing exploded into chaos, the forest unleashing its full wrath. Alex braced himself, knowing that whatever happened next, he would not face it as a victim, but as a fighter. The forest erupted into chaos as Alex faced the towering entity. The trees groaned and splintered, their branches clawing at the air as though trying to grasp him. The ground beneath his feet cracked open, revealing an endless abyss, its depths pulsating with the same crimson resin that now seemed to flow like rivers through the forest. The entity's form shifted and writhed, its hollow void of a face contorting into grotesque expressions that flickered between rage, sorrow, and mockery. Alex's grip tightened on the amulet, the only source of light in the oppressive darkness. The relic's glow grew stronger, pushing back the shadows as the entity lunged toward him, its claw-like limbs stretching impossibly long. Each movement was accompanied by a guttural roar that shook the air and made Alex's ears ring. But the forest fought back. Vines erupted from the ground, wrapping around Alex's legs, pulling him closer to the abyss. He struggled against their grip, the pain in his scar intensifying with every second. The whispers returned, this time pleading and desperate. "Stop! You'll destroy us all," they cried. But Alex could sense their deception. The forest was trying to protect itself, to keep him trapped in its endless cycle. The entity reached for him, its claws mere inches from his chest. In a final desperate act, Alex thrust the amulet forward, its light piercing through the darkness. The entity recoiled, letting out a scream that sounded like 1,000 voices wailing in unison. The amulet burned brighter, its glow now searing into the entity's form, reducing its twisted limbs to ash. As the entity disintegrated, the forest began to collapse. The trees cracked and fell, their once ancient forms crumbling into dust. The resin pools evaporated, releasing ghostly figures that faded into the night sky. Alex's sister appeared before him, her form faint and flickering. Her eyes met his, filled with gratitude and sorrow. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the cacophony of destruction. The ground beneath Alex gave way, and he fell into the abyss, the amulet still clutched in his hand. Darkness consumed him, but instead of fear, he felt a strange sense of peace. He had broken the forest's hold, but at what cost? As he closed his eyes, the last thing he saw was the faint glow of the amulet, its light fading into nothingness. When Alex awoke, he was lying at the edge of the forest, the morning sun casting long shadows across the ground. The clearing was gone, replaced by an expanse of untouched trees. But as he looked at his hands, he saw them stained with crimson resin, and the scar on his arm had transformed into the same glowing symbols he had seen on the tree. The forest was gone, but its mark remained. And deep within, Alex knew the terror was far from over. Alex staggered to his feet, the weight of the ordeal pressing down on him like a physical burden. The forest that had consumed his night was now eerily silent, its trees appearing ordinary in the light of dawn. The oppressive whispers, the malicious entity, and the cursed resin were gone, or so it seemed. But something about the air felt wrong. The sunlight, though warm on his skin, didn't dispel the lingering chill in his bones. As he looked around, Alex noticed subtle details that sent shivers down his spine. The ground where he had fallen was unnaturally smooth, as if freshly polished. No leaves or debris littered the area, and the trees, while standing tall, bore no scars or signs of age. It was as if the forest had reset itself, erasing the horrors of the night. But when Alex's gaze fell to his hands, his heart sank. The crimson resin still clung to his skin, refusing to dry or fade. It shimmered faintly in the sunlight, as though alive, and no matter how hard he tried to wipe it away, it remained. The amulet, now charred and cracked, lay in his palm. Its once powerful glow had diminished to a faint ember, but Alex could still feel its weight, not just in his hand but deep in his soul. It felt like a tether, binding him to something he couldn't yet understand. The scar on his arm burned anew, the intricate symbols etched into his skin glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. As Alex stumbled out of the forest, he found himself at the edge of a small, familiar town, the same town he had left in search of the mysterious resin. The streets were deserted, the houses shuttered, and an unnatural stillness hung in the air. It was as if time had stopped. When he glanced at his phone for the first time since entering the forest, his stomach turned. Days had passed, far more than he had spent inside. His mind raced, trying to reconcile the lost time, but no answers came. Walking through the town, Alex felt eyes on him, though the streets were empty. Shadows shifted in the corners of his vision, but when he turned, there was nothing there. The resin on his hands began to itch, the sensation growing unbearable as whispers tickled the edges of his hearing. "It's not over," they hissed, faint but insistent. Reaching his apartment, Alex locked the door and collapsed onto his couch, exhaustion overtaking him. But his rest was short-lived. That night, he was plagued by vivid nightmares. He saw the ancient tree again, its gnarled branches reaching toward him, and the shadowy entity emerging from its core. Only now, the entity's face bore a chilling resemblance to his own. In the dream, he stood before the tree, his hands dripping with resin, as the forest whispered a single word over and over, "Return." Alex woke drenched in sweat, his scar throbbing painfully. He rushed to the bathroom, splashing water on his face, but when he looked in the mirror, he froze. For a split second, his reflection didn't move with him. It stared back with hollow eyes, a sinister grin curling its lips before fading into his normal image. His breath quickened as he noticed faint red streaks on the bathroom walls, as though the resin had seeped from the mirror itself. The following days only deepened the mystery. Alex began hearing faint sobs in the quiet moments, the sound unmistakably coming from inside his home. Objects moved on their own, shifting positions when he wasn't looking. Doors creaked open, and his lights flickered at random. The scar on his arm glowed faintly in the dark, pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. One evening, desperate for answers, Alex dug through old family belongings, hoping to find something about the amulet or the forest. Hidden among his grandmother's possessions, he discovered a tattered journal. Its pages detailed the forest's curse, a cycle of entrapment and sacrifice, where those who entered rarely escaped. Those who did were marked, forever bound to the forest's will. The forest always takes its due. Escape is only temporary. The marked will always return. Beneath the entry was a crude sketch of the amulet and a single word scrawled in shaky handwriting: "Beware." As Alex stared at the journal, the sobbing sound returned, louder this time, echoing from his living room. When he turned, the resin on his hands began to drip onto the floor, forming a small pool. From its depths, a shape began to rise, a twisted figure, resembling the entity he thought he had destroyed. Its hollow eyes locked onto him, and its voice, a deep and guttural growl, spoke just one sentence: "You can never leave." The resin began to spread, seeping into the walls and floor, the shadows growing darker around him. Alex realized with horrifying clarity that the forest wasn't just in the woods anymore. It had followed him, and it would never let him go. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Haunted Grounds for more chilling tales. And remember, some places are never truly left behind.